The night my son asked me to leave, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him of the 31 years I had worked to give him everything he had, standing in front of me, using against me. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough to see that he meant it, long enough to see that he had rehearsed this, long enough to see Sandra in the doorway behind him, with her arms crossed, and the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a decision to finally be implemented. I said, "All right." I went to my room. I packed one bag, the old military duffel I had kept for 40 years, the one that has my initials on the side, in black marker, because I put them there in 1979 and never had a reason to remove them. I came back downstairs. James was still in the hallway. He looked like he had expected more resistance and wasn't entirely sure what to do with the absence of it. I picked up my keys from the hook by the door. I looked at my son. I did not say, "Do you know what you're doing?" I did not say, "You will regret this." I did not say anything at all. I walked out. I closed the door behind me, quietly, completely, the way you close a door when you want it to stay closed. I drove to a hotel 12 minutes away, and I checked in, and I sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like industrial cleaning products, and I looked at the wall. I was 68 years old. I had one duffel bag, and 6 months later, my son's company called mine. My name is Thomas Mercer, and this is the story of the word all right and everything that came after it. Let me tell you about the company first. I started Mercer Logistics in 1987. I was 32 years old. I had $12,000 in savings, a second-hand truck, and a contact list I had built over 8 years of working for other people's freight companies while quietly learning everything those companies did wrong. I want to be specific about what Mercer Logistics became, because the specificity matters to this story. By 2005, 18 years after I started, we had 47 employees, a fleet of 22 vehicles, contracts with 3 regional manufacturers and 1 national distributor, and a revenue figure that would have seemed fictional to the 32-year-old with $12,000 and a second-hand truck. By 2015, 28 years in, we were larger still. I had brought in a business partner, a man named Gerald Park, who I had known for 20 years and who had the financial acuity to complement my operational instinct. We had expanded into 2 neighboring states. We had a real office, a real management structure, real systems. I ran the company actively until I was 65. Then I stepped back. Not out, stepped back. Gerald took the operational lead. I became chairman, which in practice meant I came in 3 days a week, made the decisions that needed my specific judgment, and left the daily machinery to people who were better at daily machinery than I had ever been. I retained majority ownership. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I retained majority ownership of Mercer Logistics when I stepped back at 65. Gerald held 30%. I held the rest. James knew I had built the company. He had grown up watching me build it. The early years when I was gone before he woke and home after he slept. The middle years when things got easier and I was more present. The later years when success had become simply the water we swam in. What James did not know, what I had never told him specifically, because it had never come up, and because I am not a man who talks about money unprompted, was the current state of things. He knew I had a company. He did not know the company's current contracts, its current revenue, its current reach. He did not know, specifically, that 6 months before the night he asked me to leave, Mercer Logistics had signed a supply chain management contract with a regional distribution network. A distribution network that included, among its members, the mid-size freight forwarding company where James had worked for the past 4 years. My son worked for a company that had, without either of us knowing it at the time, become a client of mine. He asked me to leave on a Thursday evening. 6 months later, on a Monday morning, his company's operations manager called my office to discuss contract renewal terms. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My son James is 41 years old. He has my build, broad, solid, and his mother's patience, which is a quality I always admired in Eleanor and which I was glad to see pass to him. He is methodical, careful, and has a genuine competence in logistics operations that I recognized as native talent long before he chose the industry. He came by it honestly. Eleanor died 9 years ago. Breast cancer, caught late, treated aggressively and not successfully. She was 59. The year after she died was the hardest year of my life, including several years that contained genuinely difficult things. James was 32 when his mother died. He was already established in his career, already in a serious relationship with Sandra. He handled the grief in the way he handles most things, methodically, practically, not talking about it much, moving forward. I watched this and recognized it and did not push. Some things need to be processed in private. I understand that better than most. Sandra. I want to be fair to Sandra, because fairness is important, and because the full picture of Sandra is more complicated than the version of her that exists in the worst moments of this story. She is 38 years old. She grew up in a family where money was managed carefully, and its absence was felt clearly, which gave her a relationship with financial security that I understand practically, even when I found its expressions frustrating. She is organized, socially precise, and has a quality of decision. She makes up her mind quickly and holds her position, that in professional contexts would be called decisive, and in personal ones can become something harder. She and James met 7 years ago. They married 5 years ago. I attended the wedding. I sat in the appropriate place. I said the appropriate things. In the years since the wedding, I had seen them regularly. Sunday dinners, occasional weekdays. Sandra and I were cordial. Not warm, cordial. I was always aware, in her presence, of a faint evaluation occurring, the way you are aware of being assessed in professional meetings, even when no one is saying anything directly. I noted it. I did not act on it. It was not my evaluation to change. The trouble began, or at least the visible portion of it began, about 2 years ago. James and Sandra had been discussing, I learned through James, the possibility of moving. Their apartment was becoming insufficient. They wanted more space. They were thinking about the future. They had specific ideas about what that future looked like. The house they had their eye on was beyond what their combined income comfortably supported at that point. James came to me one Sunday and asked, carefully, with the particular carefulness of someone who has prepared the approach, whether I would consider moving in with them. The house they were looking at had a separate entrance suite, private, self-contained. We would share the property, but not the living space. I said I would think about it. I did think about it. For 3 weeks, I considered it genuinely, the way I consider all significant decisions. I weighed the practical benefits, the proximity to James, the help with their finances that my contribution would represent, the perhaps naive hope that more regular contact would build something between Sandra and me that cordial had never quite become. I said yes. I sold my house, the one Eleanor and I had lived in for 25 years. This was harder than I let on to anyone. A house that has 25 years of a person in it is not simply a property. But I made the decision, and I executed it. I moved in. For 8 months, things were approximately what I had hoped. Not perfect. Nothing is perfect. Sandra and I navigated the shared space with care. James seemed genuinely glad of my presence. We had dinners that felt real. I was useful. There were things I could do, things I knew, help I could provide that had nothing to do with money, and that felt like the right shape of contribution. And then, The 8 months ended, and the 9 months began, and something shifted. I noticed it first in small things. Invitations to dinner becoming slightly less frequent. Conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Not dramatically, just the almost imperceptible recalibration of a discussion being redirected. Sandra's evaluating quality becoming less masked than it had been. I gave it space. Relationships between generations in close quarters require adjustment. I knew this, but the adjustment did not stabilize. It continued in one direction. Month 11, James told me, with visible discomfort, that Sandra felt the arrangement was affecting their privacy. I said I understood and would be more conscious of that. I was. Month 13, Sandra told me directly, to her credit, directly, that she thought the long-term plan needed revisiting. I said I was open to discussing it. We did not discuss it. Month 15, James came to me on a Thursday evening. He was standing in the hallway. He said, "Dad, I think it's time for you to find your own place." I looked at him. I said, "Is this what you want, or what Sandra wants?" He said, "It's what we both think is best," which was not an answer to the question I had asked. I said, "All right," and I went and packed my bag. I stayed at the hotel for 11 days. I want to tell you about those 11 days because they were not what you might expect. They were not days of anger or grief or the particular bitterness that rejection by your own child might reasonably produce. They were, mostly, quiet days. I have spent a significant portion of my life learning to use quiet productively. In the early years of building the company, quiet was the space where I planned. In the later years, it was where I assessed. After Eleanor died, it became something else, a place I had to learn to inhabit differently, without her in it. In the hotel, quiet was where I thought clearly. On the first day, I called Gerald Park, my business partner of 20 years, answered on the second ring. He said, "Thomas, what's wrong?" I said, "Why do you assume something is wrong?" He said, "Because you never call before 9 in the morning, unless something is wrong." He was right. It was 7:40. I told him the situation briefly, and without sentiment. Gerald has known me long enough to receive information without performance. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you?" I said, "Hotel on 5th. He said, "I'll be there in an hour." Gerald arrived with coffee and the particular competence of a man who has been solving problems alongside me for 2 decades. We sat in my hotel room and we talked, not about James and Sandra specifically, but about next steps, housing, practically. My presence at the company, which had been part-time for 3 years and which we discussed recalibrating. Several other things. On day 3, I found an apartment, not temporary, permanent, a good one, in a part of the city I had always liked but never lived in. 2 bedrooms, a study, a kitchen large enough to cook in properly. I signed the lease on day 4. I moved in on day 7. On day 11, I returned the hotel key and drove to my apartment and unpacked the duffel bag and made coffee in my new kitchen and sat at my new table. I had not called James. I had not texted James. He had not called me. I noted this. I filed it. I continued. This is what I mean when I say the exit was without a word. I did not storm out. I did not leave a letter. I did not, and this required more self-discipline than I will fully admit, call James 3 days later to tell him what I thought of the decision. I simply left. I understood something that I had learned over 30 years of business. The person who leaves quietly has already won the tempo of what comes next. The person who leaves with noise has given the other side something to respond to. Quiet leaving gives them nothing, except their own thoughts, in an empty space, with no performance to react to. I gave James his empty space, and I waited to see what he did with it. 6 months is long enough for several things to happen simultaneously. Let me tell you what happened on my side first, because it is the part I have more precise information about. The apartment suited me. This surprised me slightly. I had expected to find it insufficient, a smaller life than the one I had been living. Instead, I found it clarifying. A space that is exactly the right size for one person has a particular quality of honesty that larger spaces sometimes lack. Everything in it was chosen by me, arranged by me, maintained by my own habits. There was something restoring about that. I increased my time at the company. Gerald was glad of this, not because anything had been wrong in my absence, but because there is a quality to having the founder present that is different from his absence, and both of us recognized it. I came in 4 days a week instead of 3. I was involved in the contract negotiations for 2 new accounts. I attended the quarterly review that I had skipped for the previous 2 years. I also, during this period, reviewed something I had not looked at carefully in some time, the full current contract portfolio of Mercer Logistics. It was during this review that I noticed the name, Pacific Freight Solutions. I had known the name. Gerald had mentioned it during the contract discussions 6 months earlier, when we had signed the supply chain management agreement. I had not paid close attention at the time because it was one of 7 companies in the network and was not the largest. But reviewing the portfolio, something caught my attention. I pulled the full contract file for Pacific Freight Solutions. I looked at the company profile. Pacific Freight Solutions, mid-size freight forwarding operation, regional coverage, staff of approximately 60. Operations manager, Sandra M. I sat very still for a moment. Sandra M., my daughter-in-law. James's wife. I called Gerald, I said. The Pacific Freight contract, the operations manager. Gerald said, Sandra, yes, she's been our main contact. Very efficient. Why? I said. Gerald, Sandra is my daughter-in-law. A long pause. Gerald said, you're James's wife. I said, yes. Another pause. Gerald said, does she know who we are? I said, I don't know. Does she? Gerald said, she would know the company name, Mercer Logistics, whether she connected that to you. I said, she may not have. I don't discuss the company in personal contexts. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Thomas, what do you want to do? I thought about it. I said, nothing yet. When does the contract come up for renewal? Gerald checked. He said, 6 weeks. I said, when the renewal comes up, I'll handle it personally. Gerald said, personally. I said, yes. Gerald has known me for 20 years. He said, all right, in the tone of a man who understands that something is about to happen and is staying out of the way. I said, how is she? As a contact, in your assessment. He said, highly competent, knows her numbers, negotiates well, not someone who bluffs. I said, good. I prefer dealing with people who don't bluff. I hung up. I sat in my office. The office I had built this company from, the one with the original desk I had bought second-hand in 1989 and refused to replace because it had 30 years of decisions in its grain. And I thought, not with anger, with clarity. James did not know. Sandra might not know. And in 6 weeks, the contract that employed Sandra at her current level of authority and income was going to come up for renewal, and the person sitting across the table from her was going to be me. I did not plan revenge. I want to be clear about that. What I planned was a meeting, just a meeting, with complete information on the table for the first time. The call came on a Monday morning. I was in my apartment, at my kitchen table, with coffee, when my direct office line was forwarded to my cell. I had arranged this for mornings when I worked from home. The caller ID said, Pacific Freight Solutions. I answered. A voice I recognized said, Good morning. This is Sandra Mercer, calling from Pacific Freight Solutions. I'm trying to reach someone regarding our contract renewal with Mercer Logistics. I said, "You've reached the right person." A pause. She said, "I'm sorry. Who am I speaking with?" I said, "Thomas Mercer." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time in a phone conversation. She said, "Thomas." I said, "Sandra." "Good morning." Another pause. She said, I wasn't aware that you were," I said, "still involved." "Yes, majority owner. I've been less visible for a few years, but I remain very much present." She said, "I see." I said, "I'd like to meet, to discuss the renewal in person. Would Thursday work for you?" She said, "Thursday." I said, 10 o'clock, our office." She said, "Yes, Thursday, 10 o'clock." I said, "I'll look forward to it." I hung up. I drank my coffee. On Thursday, I arrived at the office at 9:30. I had not been in the main conference room for a renewal meeting in 3 years, and I noticed, as I walked through the building, the particular quality of the space that I always noticed. The smell of it, the sound of the machinery behind the logistics floor, the way the light came through the east windows in the morning. I had built this, every square foot of it. Sandra arrived at 5 minutes to 10. I was already in the conference room. She walked in and she was, I will give her this, completely composed. Whatever the 4 days between our phone call and this meeting had been for her personally, she had not brought any of it into the room. She was professional, well prepared, briefcase in hand, the operations manager of Pacific Freight doing her job. I respected that. I stood when she entered. I said, "Sandra, thank you for coming." She said, "Thomas." She sat down. "I want to say something before we start." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "I genuinely did not know. When we signed with Mercer Logistics, I knew the company name, but I didn't connect it. It didn't occur to me that you—" I said, "I believe you." She stopped. I said, "I'm not suggesting you arranged this." I looked at the timeline. "The connection is coincidental. I believe that completely." She said, "Then why?" I said, "Because coincidence or not, here we are. And I think having this meeting, in this room, with complete information on the table, is better than any alternative." She looked at me steadily. I said, "The contract. Let's talk about the contract first. Then we can talk about everything else." We talked about the contract for 40 minutes. Sandra is, as Gerald had said, highly competent. She knew her numbers precisely, argued her company's value clearly, and negotiated with the kind of directness that I have always preferred to performance. We reached terms that worked for both sides. I said, "Good. The renewal will be processed by end of week." She said, "Thank you." I said, "Now." She looked at me. I said, "I want to tell you something, not as James's father, as someone who has been in business for 36 years and who has made enough significant decisions to have a considered view on the difference between a good one and a poor one." She said, "All right." I said, "What happened 4 months ago was a poor decision, not because of the conclusion. James and I, living under the same roof, was perhaps always going to have a natural end date. But the manner of it, a Thursday evening, no conversation, no transition, no basic consideration for a 68-year-old man who had sold his home to be available to his son." She said, "Thomas?" I said, "I'm not asking for an apology, not today. I'm telling you how I understood it, because I think you are someone who values accurate information, and I want you to have mine." She was quiet. I said, "I also want to say this. I understand you better than you think I do. I built a company from nothing. I know what financial pressure feels like. I know what it means to see a path to something better, and to clear the obstacles in that path with efficiency. I have done it myself, many times." I said, "What I learned, what 36 years taught me, is that the obstacles you clear most efficiently are sometimes the ones you should have talked to first. Because sometimes they are not obstacles. Sometimes they are the strongest thing in the structure. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Is that what you are?" I said, "I don't know. I suppose that depends on what the structure is." She said, "The family." I said, "Then yes, that's what I am." She was very still. I said, "I'd like my son to call me, not because I require it, because I think it would be good for him, and because I am, despite Thursday evening, still his father." Sandra looked at her hands briefly, then back at me. She said, "He's called you twice. You didn't answer." I said, "I know." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I wasn't ready. I needed the conversation to happen when I could have it correctly, not when I was still too close to the Thursday evening to be fair." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I'm ready." She said, "I'll tell him." I said, "Thank you." I said, "The contract renewal. We'll process it on standard terms. No changes." She said, "I appreciate that." I said, "It's a good contract. Your company performs well. The decision is commercial, not personal." She almost smiled, a small, complicated thing. She said, "You're a difficult man to read." I said, 36 years of negotiation." She said, "Is there anything else?" I said, "One more thing." She waited. I said, "Sunday dinners. James and I used to have them. Before his mother died, every Sunday without exception. After, less regularly. I would like to resume them, monthly, at minimum, at my apartment." She said, "You're inviting us to dinner?" I said, "I'm inviting my son. You are welcome to join him." She said, I appreciate the distinction." I said, "I thought you might." James called that evening, 7:15. I was making dinner, something I had started doing properly in the apartment, having discovered that cooking carefully was a good use of the hours I had previously spent in other people's company. I answered. He said, "Dad?" I said, "James." He said, "Sandra called me from the parking lot. He stopped. She said it's the same company." I said, "Yes." He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "About 8 weeks." He said, "And you didn't?" I said, "I wanted to handle the renewal meeting first, keep things in the right order." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Are you angry?" I said, "I was. For a while." "Not anymore," he said. "What are you now?" I thought about it. I said, "I'm making pasta. That's what I am right now. Come for dinner on Sunday, and we can talk about the rest." A pause. He said, "You're inviting me for dinner." I said, "I'm inviting my son for dinner." "Yes," he said. "Dad," I said, "Sunday, 7 o'clock. Bring a bottle of something red. Don't be late." He said, "We'll be there." He was there. They both were, at 6:58, with a very good bottle of red wine and the particular atmosphere of two people who have had 4 days of conversations that have led them to a place of recalibration. We had dinner. It was, I will not oversell it. It was not a reconciliation scene. It was not dramatic. It was dinner. 3 people at a table, eating pasta and drinking good wine, finding their way back to something through the ordinary medium of sharing a meal. James and I talked about the company, properly, for the first time in years. He asked questions I did not expect him to know to ask, and I realized that he had been paying more attention over more years than I had understood. Sandra was quiet for the first hour, not uncomfortable, quiet in the way of someone who is deciding where they are in a room before they speak. At some point during the second hour, she asked me about the early years of the company, the $12,000 and the second-hand truck. She had not known those details. I told her. She listened, with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand something, which I recognized as the quality that made her good at her job. At the end of the evening, at the door, James hugged me. I let him. I held on for a moment. He said, quietly, so Sandra wouldn't hear, "I should have said no. When she first..." I said, "You should have, but you didn't, and here we are. And here is far enough forward." He said, "Are we good?" I said, "We're getting there. That's better than good." He said, "Okay." I said, "Sunday, 3 weeks. Don't bring the same wine twice." He laughed, his mother's laugh, the one that takes over the whole face. That was 18 months ago. Sunday dinners have continued, mostly monthly, occasionally more. James comes reliably, which I value more than he knows. Sandra comes when she can, which is not always, given her schedule, but when she is there, she is genuinely there, asking questions, contributing to conversations, building something with the methodical patience she brings to everything. The contract between Mercer Logistics and Pacific Freight Solutions was renewed for 3 years. Gerald thinks this is funny. He told me last month, over lunch, that in 30 years of business, he has never seen a contract renewal used as a family intervention. I told him it wasn't an intervention, it was a meeting. He said, "Right, just a meeting." I said, "With complete information on the table." He said, "Of course. We are old friends." He is allowed to find things funny. James knows now the full picture of the company, the full shape of what I built and what it currently is. I told him over several Sunday dinners, piece by piece, the way you tell someone a long story when you have the time to tell it correctly. He said, after one of these dinners, "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" I said, "Because I wasn't sure you were interested." He said, "I was always interested. I just didn't know how to ask." I said, "That's a family trait." He said, "From your side or Mum's?" I said, "Both. Equally. Regrettably." He said, "We should probably work on that." I said, "Probably. We are working on it. Slowly, in the way that families work on things. Imperfectly. Inconsistently. With more sincerity than skill. But working. I still have the duffel bag. The one with my initials in black marker from 1979. I keep it on the shelf in the spare room, not as a reminder, not as a warning. Just because it's mine. It has always been mine. And some things you keep because they are yours, and there is no more complicated reason than that. The word "all right" has stayed with me. I said it on a Thursday evening in a hallway with a duffel bag at my feet, and I have thought about it many times since. What it cost to say it. What it gave me by saying it. It gave me tempo. In 36 years of business, I learned one thing above all others. The person who controls the pace of a situation controls its outcome. Not always. Nothing is always. But more often than not. When I said "all right" and walked out without another word, I chose the pace. I chose to leave before I was ready to leave, which is different from being pushed out. I chose to be quiet instead of loud, which is different from having nothing to say. I chose to wait 6 months before the meeting in the conference room, which is different from not knowing the meeting was coming. Pace, timing, patience. These are not passive qualities. They are the most active qualities I know. They require more discipline than anger. They require more courage than reaction. My son called me twice in 6 months, and I did not answer because I was not ready. When I was ready, the meeting happened in my conference room on my terms, with a contract on the table that meant neither of us could pretend the conversation was only personal, complete information, the right moment, my timing. That is the only lesson I have. It fits in one line. Leave without a word, and choose the moment you speak. I'll see you in the next one.